Mud caked the hem of Carissa's only decent skirt, drying into stiff, heavy crusts. She hated the country. She hated the sprawling, drafty estates of men who owned too much and cared too little. But mostly she hated the inevitability of what waited inside. A feral child. A wealthy, indifferent father. It was a transaction. Nothing more. Until a small boy in a velvet jacket looked up from his rocking horse and asked a question that shattered her practiced indifference. Gravel crunched beneath the heavy, iron-rimmed wheels of the carriage, a grinding sound that settled deep into Carissa's jaw. She unclenched her teeth, feeling the dull ache radiating through her skull. The carriage springs had surrendered to the rutted country roads hours ago, and every jolt sent a shockwave up her spine. The carriage lurched to a halt. Wood Manor loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette of grey stone against an equally grey, bruising sky. It did not look grand, nor did it look romantic. It looked exhausted. The sprawling ivy crawling up the west wing seemed less like decoration and more like a parasite, slowly pulling the masonry down into the mud. Carissa stepped down her boots, sinking immediately into the wet gravel. The air smelled of wet soil, rotting oak leaves, and the metallic tang of approaching rain, a sharp departure from the coal-choked smog of London she had left behind at dawn. She gripped her leather portmanteau. Its handle was slick with her own nervous sweat. Carissa was 26, unmarried, and entirely out of options. The £50 a year promised by the Duke of Ashbourne was not a fortune, but it was enough to keep her out of the workhouse and away from the pitying, suffocating stares of her married sisters. The heavy oak door swung open before she could even reach for the iron knocker. A woman stood in the threshold, severely silhouetted by the dim light of the foyer. She wore black bombazine so stiff it looked capable of standing upright on its own. "Miss Linfield, I presume," the woman said. Her voice was thin and reedy like winter wind, whistling through a cracked window pane. "I am," Carissa said. She did not curtsy. She was a governess, a professional, not a scullery maid. "I am Mrs. Gable, housekeeper. Wipe your boots. The master does not tolerate dirt on the floorboards." Carissa complied, scrubbing the soles of her boots against the stiff, unforgiving bristles of the mat until her ankles throbbed. She stepped over the threshold. The house smelled intensely of beeswax, old damp wool, and something vaguely sour, like cut lilies left in a vase a day too long. Shadows clung stubbornly to the high corners of the vaulted ceiling. The wallpaper, a dark, oppressive crimson flocking, absorbed what little natural light managed to filter through the narrow leaded windows. "You will take your meals in your room, or with the boy," Mrs. Gable instructed, immediately turning and leading Carissa up a sweeping, deeply grooved staircase. The runner carpet was threadbare in the centre, worn down by generations of heavy footsteps. The Duke is not to be disturbed unless the house is actively burning to the ground. Even then, you would do well to attempt putting it out yourself before knocking on his study door. Carissa's lips twitched. A cynical amusement bubbled in her chest. A quiet household, then. A mourning household. Mrs. Gable snapped her rigid back, stiffening further. Carissa frowned, her heavy leather bag bumping awkwardly against her knee. The agency in London had not mentioned a recent death. "I apologize. I was not informed the Duchess had passed." Mrs. Gable stopped dead on the second-floor landing. She turned slowly. Her eyes were small, hard little beads of jet. "She did not pass, Miss Linfield. She departed. There is a marked difference, particularly to the master. You will not mention her. You will not ask questions regarding her. You are here to keep Lord Ledger occupied, educated, and most importantly, out of his father's sight. Do you understand your parameters?" "Perfectly." Carissa's stomach gave a dull, hollow rumble. She hadn't eaten since a dry crust of bread yesterday afternoon. She wondered if a cup of tea was too much to ask for, but quickly decided against it. Exposing a need was never a good opening gambit with a tyrant housekeeper. They reached the third floor. The air up here was notably staler, holding the distinct metallic scent of chalk dust, brass polish, and long confinement. Mrs. Gable pushed open a heavy panelled door. "Your quarters. The nursery is adjacent. The boy is in there now. Do try to last the week, Miss Linfield." I am growing dreadfully tired of interviewing replacements." The housekeeper turned and swept back down the hall, the stiff fabric of her skirts rustling like dry husks. Carissa walked into her new room and shut the door. It was painfully small. The bed looked lumpy, the quilt faded. A single pitcher of water sat on a cracked porcelain washstand. Carissa set her heavy bag on the floor, walked to the small oval mirror, and stared at her reflection. Dark, bruised-looking circles sat heavily beneath her eyes. Her pinned hair was frizzing wildly at the temples from the damp air. She pinched her cheeks not to look pretty, but to look alive. "Right," she muttered to the empty cold room, unbuttoning her travel cloak. "Let's go meet the terror." Carissa pushed open the door to the nursery. The brass hinges whined a high, irritating sound that set her teeth on edge. The room was massive, terribly cavernous, and far too large for one child. Toys were arranged with sickening military precision on the built-in mahogany shelves. Tin soldiers stood in perfect ranks guarding nothing. A magnificent wooden train set rested on a low table completely free of dust. A beautifully carved wooden rocking horse with a real mane sat in the corner. None of it looked loved. It was a museum exhibition of a childhood, not a playroom. In the center of the sprawling Persian rug sat a boy. He was 7 years old, dressed in a navy velvet suit that looked incredibly stiff and uncomfortable. He sat cross-legged, staring at a wooden puzzle, but his hands were perfectly still in his lap. He did not look up when Carissa entered. He didn't even flinch at the whining hinges. Carissa took a slow breath. She smelled peppermint and the sharp tang of furniture oil. She walked forward, deliberately letting her boot heels click loudly on the exposed floorboards bordering the rug. "Good afternoon," Carissa said. Her voice was firm, resonant, not overly sweet. Children sniffed out fake sweetness like hounds on a fox, and Carissa had no patience for performance. "I am Miss Linfield. I am to be your new governess." The boy, Lord Ledger, slowly raised his head. He had remarkably pale skin, practically translucent at the temples, and dark, heavy-lidded eyes that seemed far too old for his small, sharp face. He lacked the round, flushed softness typical of young children. His cheekbones were already defined. A faint smudge of dark blue ink stained the side of his thumb. He stared at her. He did not blink. Carissa stood her ground. She folded her hands at her waist, feeling the rough, cheap texture of her worsted wool skirt against her knuckles. She fought a sudden, highly unprofessional urge to cross the room and smooth the unruly dark hair away from his forehead. She squashed the maternal instinct instantly. Empathy was a luxury she couldn't afford. It made you soft, and soft. Governesses got dismissed without a reference. She waited. Ledger tilted his head slightly. "Your hem is dirty." "It is," Carissa agreed without looking down. "The roads from London are mostly mud this time of year." Miss Pringle never had dirt on her clothes. "Miss Pringle is no longer here, I assume." Miss Pringle cried. Ledger stated it as a matter of empirical fact. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a complaint. Just raw data. She cried in the corner by the window. She ruined 2 handkerchiefs. Then she packed her trunk. Carissa felt a flicker of profound irritation. Not at the boy, but at the sprawling, broken mess of this family. She was far too exhausted for psychological warfare with a 7-year-old aristocrat. She walked over to a heavy wooden chair near the cold fireplace, pulled it out with a loud scrape that echoed off the high ceilings, and sat down. She let out a long, very unladylike sigh, wiggling her aching toes inside her stiff leather boots. Ledger watched her, his dark brows drawing together in genuine confusion. Governesses did not sigh loudly. Governesses did not sit until formally invited. Governesses certainly did not slump back into the upholstery. "Are you going to cry?" he asked. His voice was small but sharp, like a tiny shard of glass. "I haven't the energy to cry, my lord," Carissa said bluntly, resting her hands on the armrests. "Crying requires a great deal of hydration, and I haven't been offered a cup of tea since yesterday afternoon." Ledger blinked. It was the first crack in his eerie composure. He looked down at the wooden puzzle on the floor, then back up at Carissa. He stood up, meticulously smoothing his velvet trousers. He took 3 deliberate steps toward her and stopped. He looked up, his dark eyes suddenly wide, boring directly into hers. You're going to leave my daddy too, aren't you? The question didn't hang gracefully in the air. It dropped like an iron anvil into a shallow pond. Carissa felt a sudden physical jolt in her ribs. She had expected defiance. She had expected tantrums, thrown toys, or cold silence. She had not expected this raw, bleeding emotional wound to be ripped open and shoved in her face within 5 minutes of her arrival. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Beneath the stiff, expensive velvet and the rigid, aristocratic posture, his lower lip was trembling. Just a microscopic fraction, but it was there. He was testing her, certainly, but he was also terrified. He had watched his mother walk out the door. He had watched a parade of temporary women pack their trunks and abandon him. He was trying to beat her to the punch, striking first before he could be left behind again. Carissa didn't reach out to hug him. She knew better. Physical touch was cheap and meaningless if it wasn't earned. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees, bringing her face down closer to his level. She smelled the faint, sweet scent of warm milk on his breath, mixed with the dusty, stagnant air of the nursery. "Listen to me very carefully, Ledger," she said, deliberately dropping his title. Her voice was a low, steady hum, devoid of pity, but full of absolute conviction. "I do not know your daddy. I have never met the man. He might be a saint, or he might be a miserable wretch. I frankly do not care. I am not here for him. I am here because I need the £50 a year he pays me to teach you mathematics, history, and French. As long as those coins are placed in my hand at the end of the month, I am staying right here, in this chair. Do we understand each other?" Ledger stared at her. His small chest rose and fell in a jagged, uneven breath. He processed her bluntness, turning it over in his mind. He was looking for the lie, scanning her face for the false pity he was undoubtedly used to. He found none, just the tired, pragmatic reality of a working woman. Slowly, the brittle tension drained from his rigid shoulders. He looked away, staring at the dried mud flaking off the sides of her boots. "I hate French," he mumbled to the floorboards. "So do I," Carissa said, leaning back into the chair and relaxing her posture. "It's entirely too nasal. We shall suffer through it together." The summons came precisely at 8 o'clock. A maid with a terrifyingly blank expression and a remarkably quiet footfall tapped on the nursery door, informing Carissa that the Duke of Ashbourne required her presence in his study. Carissa walked down the dimly lit corridors. The massive house was settling for the night, groaning in its joints like an old wooden ship. The air grew significantly colder as she descended the grand staircase to the ground floor. She navigated the shadowed hallways until she reached the heavy mahogany doors of the study. She knocked twice. The wood was solid, bruising her knuckles through the skin. "Enter," a voice rumbled from within. It sounded like gravel shifting underfoot. Carissa pushed the heavy door open. The study was suffocatingly warm, heated by a massive roaring fire in a cavernous stone hearth. The air was thick, practically chewable, heavy with the smell of burning oak-damp wool and the sharp medicinal sting of straight Scotch, Aquila wood. The Duke of Ashbourne sat behind a sprawling, disorganized desk, piled dangerously high with leather-bound ledgers and loose correspondence. He did not look up when she entered. He was scratching furiously at a piece of parchment with a steel-nibbed pen. Carissa stood in silence before the desk. She took him in, reconciling the man before her with the gossip she had heard in London. The society papers portrayed him as a brooding, tragic romantic figure, a wealthy lord betrayed by a fickle wife. The reality was profoundly less glamorous. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full, uninterrupted night in 3 years. His hair, a dark, muted brown, was shoved haphazardly back from his forehead, standing up in messy, chaotic tufts. He wore no jacket. His charcoal waistcoat was unbuttoned at the bottom, and his white shirt cuffs were visibly frayed at the edges, the threads hanging loose. Ink stained his fingers, mirroring the smudge she had seen on his son's thumb. He threw the pen down. It clattered sharply against a crystal inkwell. He finally looked up. His eyes were the exact same dark, heavy-lidded shape as Ledger's, but where the boy's held terrified, defensive defiance, Aquila's held only a bone-deep, hollow exhaustion. His eyes were severely red-rimmed, the skin beneath them bruised with fatigue. He rubbed a hand over his face, the rough sound of his palm against day-old stubble loud in the quiet room. "Miss Linfield," he said. His voice was entirely flat. "Your Grace." Carissa kept her chin level, refusing to fidget under his gaze. "Mrs. Gable tells me you survived the afternoon." He reached for a heavy crystal tumbler resting on the edge of his desk, bringing it to his lips. The sharp smell of scotch deepened in the warm space between them. "I did. Lord Ledger and I are currently negotiating a complex treaty regarding the memorization of French verbs." Aquila stopped mid-swallow. He slowly lowered the glass, staring at her over the rim. He seemed genuinely surprised she had spoken back with anything other than a terrified, deferential murmur. He set the glass down with a heavy, definitive thud on the wood. "He hasn't bitten you then, or thrown a heavy object?" Aquila asked, leaning back in his leather chair, which squeaked loudly in protest. "He broke the last governess's nose with a solid bronze horse." Carissa raised an eyebrow. "He asked me if I was going to abandon him like everyone else in his life. I found blunt honesty to be a much better shield than dodging bronze horses." Aquila went completely still. The silence in the room instantly became a physical weight, pressing uncomfortably against Carissa's eardrums. The only sound was the violent crackle and hiss of the fire in the grate. Aquila looked away from her, his jaw working tightly as if he were chewing on a bitter root. He stared over her shoulder at a large, pale, rectangular patch on the dark mahogany wall paneling. A portrait had clearly been removed. The wood beneath was brighter, unfaded by the sun and time. "And what honesty did you feed him, Miss Linfield?" Aquila asked. His tone was dangerously quiet now. It was a terrifyingly calm quiet, the kind of quiet that usually preceded a swift dismissal. "I told him that I am deeply fond of my wages," Carissa said. She didn't flinch. She desperately needed this job, but she refused to cower. "And that as long as you pay them, I have absolutely no intention of leaving." Aquila's eyes snapped back to hers. He studied her, truly seeing her for the first time. He took in her cheap, unadorned worsted dress, the frizzy hair she couldn't quite tame, the mud still caked on the edges of her boots, and the absolute lack of fear in her rigid posture. £50, he muttered almost to himself, a sardonic twist touching the corner of his mouth. "You value your continued presence rather cheaply, Miss Linfield." "I value a solid roof, Your Grace. The current market rate for governesses is abysmal, and I am pragmatic." A short, sudden sound escaped Aquila's throat. It took Carissa a second to realize it was a laugh. It was a rusty hollow and lacked any real joy, but it was a laugh nonetheless. "Right," Aquila said, the momentary tension leaking out of him, leaving only the hollow shell of a man trying to manage an endless ledger of personal losses. "Keep him alive. Keep him reasonably quiet. Try to put something in his head that isn't entirely resentful. Do that, and you will have your £50, and a substantial bonus at Christmas, provided I don't have to listen to him scream from the East Wing." "I will absolutely hold you to that bonus, Your Grace," Carissa said. Aquila looked at her for a long moment, the ghost of an amused smirk lingering on his tired face. "I firmly believe you will." He waved a hand dismissively toward the heavy doors. "Good evening, Miss Linfield." "Good evening." Carissa turned on her heel and walked out, grabbing the brass handle and pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The metal latch clicked securely into place. She stood alone in the cold, drafty hallway, her heart beating a slightly faster rhythm against her ribs. She smelled the faint ghost of cigar smoke clinging to the wool of her skirt. The boy was broken. The father was empty. The house was a suffocating tomb. Carissa adjusted her frayed cuffs, feeling the rough, familiar wool against her wrists. She had survived day one. November sank its teeth into Wood Manor. It did not arrive with a picturesque frost, but with a relentless, bone-aching dampness that settled into the heavy curtains and turned the floorboards into blocks of ice. Carissa's knuckles were perpetually raw. The cheap lye soap provided by Mrs. Gable stripped the moisture from her skin, leaving angry split-red lines across the backs of her hands. She rubbed a dollop of smuggled mutton fat into them every night, grimacing at the smell, but she needed her fingers to hold chalk. Ledger was not a terror. That would have been easier. A terror could be disciplined. A terror threw tantrums that exhausted themselves. Ledger was a fortress. He was perfectly maddeningly polite but utterly impenetrable. He memorized his multiplication tables with a vacant stare. He recited the capitals of Europe in a terrifyingly flat monotone. He was doing exactly what was required to ensure Carissa received her £50 and absolutely nothing more. They sat in the nursery on a Tuesday afternoon. The fire was smoking slightly, a sharp, acrid scent of green wood that stung Carissa's eyes. Outside, a miserable drizzle coated the leaded windows in a film of grey sludge. Carissa pushed a heavy leather-bound volume across the scarred wooden table. Moral Tales for the Young Gentleman. "Read the passage on filial duty, please," Carissa said. She hated the book. It was preachy and dry-smelling faintly of mildew. Ledger looked down at the open page. His small hands remained in his lap. He stared at the illustration of a smiling mother and an obedient boy holding a hoop. A long, stretching silence filled the room, broken only by the hiss of sap popping in the weak fire. "Ledger," he did not blink. He lifted his right hand, pinched the top corner of the thick paper, and slowly, deliberately tore a 2-inch triangle from the page. The ripping sound was loud in the quiet room. He placed the torn scrap on the table and looked up at her. Carissa felt a hot spike of anger behind her eyes. She wanted to yell. She wanted to shake him. She was tired, her feet were freezing, and she had survived on cold porridge for breakfast. She clamped her jaw shut, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She looked at the torn page. She looked at Ledger's defiant, terrified eyes. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for her to pack her trunk. Carissa leaned forward. She picked up the torn scrap of paper, folded it neatly in half, and slipped it into her pocket. She reached out, slammed the heavy book shut with a loud crack, and shoved it to the far end of the table. It slid off the edge and hit the floorboards with a satisfying thud. Ledger flinched. Just a fraction. "Fine," Carissa said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "I detest that book anyway. The author clearly never met an actual human child." She stood up, her stiff skirt scraping against the chair legs. She walked over to the towering mahogany bookshelf, running her cracked finger along the spines. She pulled out a massive dusty atlas and dragged it back to the table, dropping it in front of him. "Open it to page 42. Ledger hesitated, his brow furrowing. He slowly opened the heavy cover. The page displayed a highly detailed hand-drawn map of the Battle of Agincourt. "Look at the terrain," Carissa commanded, sitting back down and crossing her arms to preserve her body heat. The French had heavily armoured cavalry. The English had longbowmen and a massive field of thick, churning mud. If you were King Henry, how would you arrange your archers to ensure the French horses bogged down before they could reach your lines? Ledger stared at the map. His dark eyes slowly flicked from the blue ink representing the French to the red ink of the English. He reached out his small, ink-stained index finger, tracing the contour lines of a hill. "I'd put stakes in the mud," he murmured, his voice losing that terrifyingly flat monotone for the first time in 2 weeks. "Sharp ones, to break the horses' legs." "Brutal," Carissa noted, leaning back in her chair, "but historically accurate. Now calculate the trajectory of an arrow fired from this ridge." They did not discuss the torn morality book. They did not speak of mothers or duty. They spent 2 hours slaughtering imaginary Frenchmen in the mud. By the time the dinner bell rang, Ledger's fingers were coated in charcoal from drawing defensive perimeters, and Carissa realized she had stopped shivering. It wasn't affection. It wasn't love. But it was a truce negotiated over a shared appreciation for absolute pragmatic survival. Dust motes danced aggressively in the single beam of pale sunlight, piercing the gloom of the Duke's private library. Carissa sneezed, a sharp, undignified sound that echoed off the towering walls of books. She rubbed her nose with the back of her wool sleeve. She wasn't supposed to be here. Mrs. Gable had made it abundantly clear that the ground-floor library was Aquila Wood's sanctuary. But Ledger had burned through the Agincourt material in 3 days, demanding to know how siege engines operated. The nursery shelves held nothing but fables and elementary grammar. If Carissa was going to keep the boy engaged, she needed heavier artillery. Literally. She stood on the third rung of a rolling mahogany ladder, squinting at the top shelf. The leather bindings were cracked and dry, smelling of vanilla and old parchment. She spotted a thick, heavy spine bearing the faded gold title Mechanics of the Roman Siege. She reached for it. Her fingertips barely brushed the top edge. She stretched her worn boots, slipping slightly on the polished wood of the ladder rung. She gripped the shelf with her left hand, hauling herself up another inch, and hooked her right index finger over the top of the heavy book. She pulled. It was wedged tight between two encyclopedias. She gave a sharp yank. The book broke free with sudden, violent momentum. Carissa lost her balance, her left foot slipping entirely off the rung. She pitched backward, letting out a short, sharp gasp, dropping the heavy book to blindly grab at the ladder rails. She didn't fall to the floor. She crashed solidly into a wall of rough, damp wool and solid muscle. Large hands gripped her waist hard, bruising and entirely ungentle, steadying her violently before she could collapse. The Roman siege book hit the Persian rug with a concussive thud that rattled the nearby tea cart. "Jesus Christ!" A rough voice barked directly into her ear. Carissa scrambled forward, untangling herself from the grip, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She spun around her hands instinctively, flying to smooth her disheveled hair. Aquila stood there. He was breathing heavily, his dark coat damp with fresh rain. He smelled intensely of wet earth horse sweat and the sharp bite of cold air. He looked furious. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped violently beneath his cheekbone. "Are you making a habit of destroying my property, Miss Linfield?" Aquila snapped, his dark eyes cutting from her flushed face down to the book splayed open on the rug. "Or do you simply lack the basic motor function required to climb a ladder?" Carissa's embarrassment instantly evaporated, replaced by a flare of hot defensive irritation. She didn't cower. She stepped off the bottom rung, bringing herself to her full, unimpressive height. "If the ladder had been properly secured, Your Grace, I wouldn't have slipped. And if your nursery possessed adequate educational materials, I wouldn't have to raid your private shelves like a common thief." Aquila stared at her. He seemed completely derailed by her refusal to apologize. He looked down at the book on the floor, then back up at her, an incredulous frown digging deep lines between his brows. "You are stealing Mechanics of the Roman Siege," he said, his voice dropping slightly, the raw anger shifting into profound confusion. "For a 7-year-old. Your son is bored." "Your Grace," Carissa said bluntly, bending down. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet room as she retrieved the heavy book. She brushed the dust off the cover with a sharp, dismissive slap. "When he is bored, he tears up my textbooks. I find that engaging his mind with ballistics and trebuchets is significantly more productive than forcing him to read morality tales." Aquila took a slow step forward. The space between them felt suddenly uncomfortably small. He wasn't looking at her as a servant anymore. He was looking at her the way one studies a bizarre, unfamiliar species of insect. "You are teaching my son how to build weapons of war. I am teaching him applied mathematics and physics," Carissa corrected, clutching the heavy book to her chest. It felt like a shield. "If he happens to learn how to breach a fortified castle wall in the process, I consider it a bonus. He has a brilliant mind. It is entirely wasted on grammar drills." A heavy silence descended. The only sound was the distant, muffled ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Aquila looked exhausted. The bruised shadows under his eyes seemed darker in the pale library light. He ran a hand through his damp, chaotic hair, sighing a long, ragged exhalation that sounded like a man giving up on a very long argument. "Does it keep him quiet?" Aquila asked finally. "We spent 3 hours yesterday calculating the trajectory required to launch a theoretical boulder over the manor's roof," Carissa said honestly. "He didn't break a single thing. He didn't cry. He simply did the math." Aquila's mouth twitched. It was an infinitesimal movement quickly suppressed, but Carissa caught the briefest flash of dark, weary amusement. "Fine," Aquila muttered, stepping around her to head toward his massive desk. He didn't look back. "Take the book. Take whatever you need from the lower shelves. Just don't let him actually build a trebuchet. Mrs. Gable would likely have a stroke if he destroyed the greenhouse." "I make no promises regarding the greenhouse, Your Grace," Carissa said. Aquila stopped mid-stride. He turned his head, looking back at her over his shoulder. Their eyes locked. The air in the library suddenly felt thick-heavy with the unspoken recognition of two deeply tired people, recognizing a mutual pragmatic defiance in one another. He didn't smile, but the harsh, rigid lines of his face had softened just a fraction. "Try to keep the casualties to a minimum, Miss Linfield. I will do my utmost, Your Grace." Carissa turned and walked out of the library, the heavy Roman history book clutched tightly in her arms. She smelled the damp wool of Aquila's coat lingering on her own sleeves. She walked back up the freezing, drafty staircase toward the nursery, a strange, unbidden heat blooming in her chest. It wasn't romance. It was the thrill of a small, hard-won victory. December brought ice that coated the windows of Ashbourne Hall in thick, opaque sheets. It didn't snow. It simply froze, locking the manor in a brittle grey cage. Carissa slept in a heavy wool cardigan over her flannel nightgown, 2 pairs of thick stockings pulled up to her knees, and still she woke shivering. The scream tore through the silence at 3 in the morning. It wasn't a child's standard cry for a glass of water or a bad dream. It was a raw, ragged shriek, an animal caught in a steel trap, violently tearing itself apart to get free. Carissa threw off her heavy quilt. The freezing air hit her skin like a physical blow. She didn't bother with slippers. Her bare feet slapped against the icy floorboards of the corridor as she sprinted toward Ledger's room. The heavy oak door was already ajar, a weak wedge of light spilling into the hallway. She pushed it open, her chest heaving. The room smelled of sour sweat, burning lamp oil, and sheer panic. Ledger was tangled in the center of his massive bed. The heavy linen sheets were twisted around his legs like ropes. He was thrashing violently, his small hands curled into tight fists, punching blindly at the empty air. His eyes were wide open, reflecting the frantic jumping flame of the bedside lamp, but he wasn't seeing the room. He was trapped somewhere far darker. "Mama, don't stop the carriage. Mama." His voice broke on the last syllable, dissolving into a ragged, choking sob. Carissa rushed to the bed. She didn't whisper sweet nothings. She didn't coo. Night terrors didn't respond to gentleness. They required gravity. She grabbed his flailing wrists, her grip firm and uncompromising. His small bones felt fragile under her rough, calloused fingers, but he fought her with shocking strength. "Ledger!" Carissa commanded, her voice dropping into a sharp, low register. "Stop fighting! Look at me!" He bucked a stray elbow, catching her hard in the collarbone. Carissa winced, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth, but she didn't let go. She pressed her weight down on the mattress, leaning over him, forcing him to register her physical presence. Footsteps pounded heavily in the corridor. The door slammed open. Aquila stood in the threshold. He wore loose, dark trousers and a rumpled white shirt, left entirely unbuttoned, exposing the shadowed plane of his chest. He held a heavy brass candlestick, his knuckles bone white around the metal. He looked wild. He smelled intensely of stale tobacco, unwashed skin, and the sharp bite of scotch. He froze the second he saw the bed. "Mama!" Ledger screamed again, his spine arching off the mattress. Aquila's face drained of color. He looked as though he had been physically struck. The heavy candlestick trembled in his grip. He stared at his thrashing son, paralyzed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. He wasn't a duke right now. He wasn't a formidable master of an estate. He was a deeply broken man watching the living ghost of his ruined marriage torture his only child. He didn't step forward. He actually took a half step back, his heel scraping against the threshold. Anger, hot and entirely un-Governess-like, flared in Carissa's chest. "Do not walk away from him!" Carissa barked over Ledger's screams. She didn't care that he paid her wages. She didn't care about his title. "Put that ridiculous candle down and get over here." Aquila blinked, jolted by the sheer authority in her tone. He doesn't want me." Aquila rasped, his voice sounding like torn sandpaper. "He's calling for her." "He is asleep, you idiot!" Carissa yelled, using her body weight to pin Ledger's shoulders down. The boy was slick with feverish sweat, his pulse hammering visibly against the fragile skin of his neck. "He is trapped in a memory. He needs an anchor. Hold his legs before he breaks his own ankle in these sheets." Aquila stared at her for one agonizing second. Then the paralysis broke. He dropped the candlestick. It hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy clatter. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the mattress groaning in loud protest as he dropped his weight onto the edge. He reached out his large hands, awkwardly gripping Ledger's violently kicking calves. He didn't know how to hold a child. His grip was entirely too rigid, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of Ledger's nightshirt. Not like a vice. Carissa snapped her hair falling out of its messy braid to stick to her damp forehead. Press down. Deep pressure. Ground him. Aquila shifted his grip, pressing his heavy palms flat against Ledger's shins, using his significant upper body strength to steadily anchor the boy to the bed. Carissa leaned down until her face was inches from Ledger's ear. She didn't offer empty comfort. She offered geography. Ledger would. She said, her voice a steady rhythmic drumbeat over his erratic sobs. You are in Ashbourne Hall. It is December. It is freezing. Your father is holding your legs. I am holding your hands. There is no carriage. There is only a bed, and it is safe. She repeated it, over and over, a mundane, boring litany of facts. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent thrashing began to subside. The screaming downgraded to exhausted, wet gasps. The terrifying vacant stare broke, and Ledger blinked, actually seeing the room. He looked at Carissa's face hovering over his. He looked down at the massive, unfamiliar weight of his father's hands on his legs. He didn't cry for his mother anymore. He just started to shake. A deep, bone-rattling tremor of absolute exhaustion. Carissa let go of his wrists. She slumped back on her heels, her chest heaving, wiping a strand of sweat-soaked hair from her eyes. Her collarbone throbbed fiercely where he had struck her. Aquila didn't move. His hands were still pressed against Ledger's legs. He was staring at the boy's pale, tear-streaked face, his own expression a terrifying mix of awe and profound shame. He slowly pulled his hands back, as if afraid he might break the fragile quiet. Is he ill? Aquila asked, his voice barely above a ragged whisper. He's grieving, Carissa said bluntly, pulling the heavy quilt up to cover Ledger's trembling shoulders. He has an ocean of it inside him, and during the day, he holds it behind a dam of perfect manners. At night, the dam breaks. Aquila swallowed hard. He looked at Carissa, really looked at her. He saw the cheap, frayed cardigan her bare feet blew from the cold floorboards, the fierce, uncompromising set of her jaw. She looked exhausted, dishevelled, and entirely magnificent. Thank you, he said. It wasn't a formal courtesy. It sounded like it had been dragged out of his chest with a rusted hook. Don't thank me, Carissa said, standing up. The cold air hit her sweat-dampened clothes, making her violently shiver. He doesn't need a governess to fight his nightmares, Your Grace. He needs his father to stop hiding in the library. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the Duke alone with his son. 3 days later, a fragile, deeply uncomfortable tension hung in the damp air of the manor. Aquila had not retreated to the library. He had not joined them for breakfast, but Carissa felt his presence hovering at the periphery of their routine. Doors that were normally shut tight were left slightly ajar. Heavy footsteps paused outside the nursery before moving on. He was circling them, a wary predator trying to figure out how to approach the trap without getting caught. Ledger was quiet. Quieter than usual. The night terror had drained him, leaving him pale and lethargic. He sat at the nursery table staring blankly at a wooden block. Carissa couldn't stand the stagnant air any longer. Get your boots on, she ordered, tossing her own frayed wool cloak over her shoulders. We are going to the greenhouse. Mrs. Gable had strictly forbidden the greenhouse. It was located at the far end of the overgrown gardens, an abandoned glass structure that hadn't been heated or maintained since the Duchess left. They crunched across the frozen dead grass of the lawn. The sky was the colour of a bruised plum. Carissa pushed open the rusted iron door of the greenhouse. It whined in loud, scraping protest. Inside, it was a graveyard of ambition. Smashed terracotta pots littered the stone floor. Dead blackened vines clung stubbornly to the glass panes, blocking out the weak light. The air smelled of dry rot dust and the ghost of old soil, but it was slightly warmer than the biting wind outside. Why are we here? Ledger asked, his breath puffing in small white clouds. Because we are going to build a trebuchet, and if we do it in the nursery, your father will deduct the damages from my wages, Carissa said, pulling a bundle of thick twine and a sharp pocket knife from her cloak pocket. Find me a heavy flat stone and some long sturdy branches. For the first time in 3 days, a tiny spark lit behind Ledger's dark eyes. He didn't smile, but he immediately turned and began digging through a pile of dead blackberry bushes. For an hour they worked in the freezing dust. Carissa sat on a cracked, overturned wooden crate, her fingers numb and clumsy, as she tried to lash 3 thick oak branches into a tripod. Ledger was intensely focused, gathering smooth stones for the counterweight. It was messy. It was entirely unscholarly. Carissa wiped her nose with the back of a dirty glove, leaving a smudge of soil across her cheek. The fulcrum is wrong. The rough, gravelly voice echoed loudly off the glass panes. Carissa jumped the pocketknife, slipping and nicking her thumb. She hissed, immediately pressing the cut against her heavy wool skirt. Aquila stepped out from behind a massive dead citrus tree. He wore a heavy riding coat, mud splattered up to the knees of his boots. He smelled of horse sweat and leather. He must have followed them out here. Ledger froze, dropping a stone. It hit the pavement with a loud crack. He immediately took a step backward, his posture stiffening into that terrifyingly perfect defensive rigidity. Aquila ignored Carissa entirely. He walked straight toward the lopsided, pathetic-looking wooden tripod she was trying to secure. He stopped in front of it, staring down at the messy knots of twine. If you attempt to launch anything heavier than a walnut with this, Aquila said, his voice completely flat, the tension will snap the throwing arm, and it will ricochet backward. You'll take off your own head. Carissa stood up, her knee joints popping. She was ready to fight. She was ready to defend their messy, dirty project against his aristocratic disdain. We are making do with scavenged materials, Your Grace, Carissa said, her chin lifting defiantly. It is a lesson in mechanics, not precision engineering. Aquila finally looked at her. He took in the dirt on her cheek, the messy hair escaping her pins, the small spot of blood blooming on her thumb. He didn't look angry. He looked painfully, intensely awake. He didn't argue. He unbuttoned his heavy riding coat and let it drop carelessly onto a pile of dead ferns. He was wearing a dark wool waistcoat over a linen shirt. He rolled up his right sleeve, exposing a thick, muscular forearm dusted with dark hair. He knelt down in the dirt next to the tripod. Ledger, Aquila said, not looking at the boy, but keeping his eyes on the wood. Bring me that straight piece of ashwood near the door, and your pocket knife, Miss Linfield. Carissa hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she stepped forward and handed him the knife handle first. His rough, calloused fingers brushed against hers. The brief contact felt strangely hot in the freezing air. Ledger didn't move. He stared at his father's broad back, his small face a mask of absolute bewilderment. His father did not sit in the dirt. His father did not build things. Ledger. Aquila repeated his tone, softening just a fraction, losing the authoritative bark. The ashwood, please. The counterweight needs to be perfectly balanced, or we're going to break a glass pane, and Mrs. Gable will likely murder all 3 of us. Ledger blinked. Slowly he walked to the door, picked up the long, straight branch and carried it over. He didn't hand it over. He stood a few feet away, holding it out like an offering to a volatile deity. Aquila reached out and took it. Sit down, he instructed, pointing to a relatively clean patch of stone. Watch the binding. For the next 2 hours, the Duke of Ashbourne sat in the dirt of a ruined greenhouse, meticulously carving notches into scavenged wood. He didn't speak of nightmares. He didn't speak of absent mothers. He spoke entirely in the safe, neutral language of tension release and trajectory. Carissa watched them. She stood near the overturned crate, her hands buried deep in her pockets. The freezing air no longer bothered her. Aquila's hands were remarkably capable. They weren't soft, aristocratic hands. They were strong, precise, and currently coated in dry mud and sap. He showed Ledger how to lash the joints tightly, letting the boy pull the twine taut while he held the wood steady. They weren't hugging. They weren't having a tearful breakthrough. They were simply occupying the same physical space, without defensive walls. "All right," Aquila said finally, standing up and brushing the dirt from his expensive trousers, permanently ruining the fabric. He stepped back. "Load it." Ledger carefully placed a small, smooth stone into the crude leather sling Carissa had fashioned from an old glove. He looked at Aquila, seeking permission. Aquila nodded. "Pull the pin." Ledger yanked the stick, holding the throwing arm down. The counterweight dropped with a heavy thud. The ash branch snapped upward with a violent thwack. The stone flew through the air in a perfect, brutal arc, sailing straight through a broken glass pane in the roof and disappearing into the grey afternoon. Ledger gasped, his hands flying to his mouth, his dark eyes wide with shock. A heavy, breathless silence filled the greenhouse. Then Aquila Wood laughed. It wasn't the rusty, hollow sound Carissa had heard in the study. It was a deep, chest-rumbling, genuine laugh. It echoed off the glass, startling a pair of pigeons from the roof. He ran a dirty hand through his messy hair, grinning down at his son. "Excellent trajectory," Aquila said. Ledger stared at his father. Slowly, miraculously, the tight, defensive line of the boy's mouth broke. The corners twitched upward. It was small. It was hesitant. But it was a smile. Aquila looked up, his gaze, catching Carissa's across the ruined floor. The laughter faded from his eyes, replaced by something much heavier, much more dangerous. The air between them pulled taut, vibrating like the loaded arm of the trebuchet right before the pin was pulled. He saw her. He recognized exactly what she had orchestrated. Carissa didn't look away. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the hit, before turning to brush the dirt from her skirt. The siege walls were cracking. Soot stained the edges of the drawing room hearth, a stark contrast to the obsessive cleanliness Mrs. Gable usually enforced. Carissa didn't point it out. She sat in a high-backed armchair, a pile of mending in her lap, pulling a heavy steel needle through the thick wool of Ledger's torn stocking. The rhythmic snick of the thread was the only sound competing with the aggressive popping of the fire. 2 weeks had passed since the greenhouse. The manor hadn't magically transformed into a warm, joyful home. That was a fable for cheap penny dreadfuls. It was still drafty. It was still quiet. But the quality of the silence had shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. It was the hesitant, fragile quiet of a convalescent ward. Aquila sat across the room. He wasn't in his study. He was in the drawing room, a ledger balanced precariously on his knee. He was making a spectacular mess of trying to read it, while Ledger sat on the rug at his feet, dismantling a perfectly good brass clock to see the gears. A tiny spring shot out from the clock face, pinging sharply against the brass fender of the fireplace. Aquila sighed a long, rough sound. He closed the ledger, resting his heavy hand on the leather cover. He looked down at the boy. "If you cannot reassemble that, your grandfather will haunt us both. He brought that back from Geneva." "I can put it back," Ledger said. He didn't look up, his small fingers stained with black grease. "Miss Linfield explained talk yesterday." Aquila's gaze drifted slowly across the room, landing heavily on Carissa. She kept her eyes on her mending, but the skin on the back of her neck prickled. The needle slipped, digging painfully into the calloused pad of her thumb. She didn't flinch, but she tasted the sudden metallic spike of adrenaline in the back of her throat. "Talk." Aquila repeated, his voice low, a dark amusement threading through the gravelly timbre. "Are we planning to dismantle the carriage next, Miss Linfield? Only if the axles require greasing, your grace," Carissa replied, refusing to look up. She tied off the thread with a sharp, decisive pull and bit the end cleanly with her teeth. "Go wash your hands, Ledger," Aquila instructed. "Dinner will be served shortly. Do not touch the wallpaper on your way to the basin." Ledger stood up, wiping a streak of grease across his linen shirt. He didn't argue. He didn't march like a tin soldier. He just walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The silence rushed back in, but it was abruptly heavy, charged with a strange, crackling static. Carissa kept her eyes on the torn stocking, folding it with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Aquila stood up. The leather of his chair squeaked loudly. He walked over to the fireplace, leaning his forearm against the heavy oak mantelpiece. The fire cast deep flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angle of his jaw and the permanent exhaustion etched around his eyes. He slept through the night, Aquila said quietly. 3 nights in a row. Routine helps, Carissa said, her voice entirely too tight. She hated this. She hated the sudden, terrifying vulnerability of being alone with him in a room that smelled like roasted chestnuts and expensive tobacco. It eroded her armor. It isn't routine, Aquila corrected, turning his head to look at her. His dark eyes were unnervingly focused. It's you. Carissa stood up, letting the mending drop into the basket. She needed to put distance between them. The air near the fire was too thick, too warm. I am simply doing the job you pay me for, your grace. Stop hiding behind the ledger, Carissa. He didn't yell, but the use of her first name hit her like a physical blow to the sternum. She froze. Her fingers curled tightly into the rough fabric of her skirt. Aquila pushed off the mantelpiece, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He smelled of soap wool and the bitter edge of black tea. You aren't just a governess, Aquila said, his voice dropping to a harsh, raw whisper. You barged into this mausoleum and started breaking the windows. You forced him to breathe. You forced me to breathe. Carissa looked up. She couldn't help it. His face was inches from hers. She saw the tiny silver threads in his dark hair, the rough texture of his skin where the razor had missed a spot along his jawline. She felt a terrifying, irrational urge to reach up and smooth the deep crease between his brows. She violently crushed the instinct. And what happens when he is sent off to Eton? Carissa asked, her voice shaking with forced pragmatism. She stepped back, putting a crucial foot of cold air between them. What happens when he no longer needs ballistics lessons in the dirt? I pack my trunk. I move to the next drafty house. I am a temporary fixture, Aquila. Do not confuse gratitude with permanence. Aquila's jaw tightened. He looked as though she had slapped him. The raw vulnerability in his eyes slammed shut, replaced instantly by the rigid, formidable mask of the Duke. Of course, Aquila said, his voice turning entirely flat, stripped of all warmth. Pragmatism above all. Forgive my lapse in propriety, Miss Linfield. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him with agonizing finality. Carissa stood alone by the fire, her chest tight, listening to the ticking of the dismantled clock. She had survived. She had protected her boundaries. So why did it feel exactly like tearing out her own heart? March arrived with a violent, muddy thaw. The frost melted, turning the estate grounds into a treacherous, sucking bog. Carissa stood in her small, freezing bedroom, staring at the leather portmanteau open on her lumpy bed. Next to it sat a small velvet pouch. £50, plus a £10 bonus in heavy silver crowns. Aquila had sent it up with Mrs. Gable that morning, exactly on the quarter day. No note, no summons to the study, just the transaction they had agreed upon. She folded a stiff linen blouse and pressed it into the corner of the bag. Her hands were shaking. She was leaving. It was the only logical choice. The drawing room incident had shattered the careful, cynical detachment she relied on to survive. She was waking up eager to see the boy. She was lingering in the hallways, hoping to catch the scent of tobacco and wet wool. She was drowning slowly and willingly in a life that did not belong to her. If she stayed, she would love them. If she loved them, they would eventually destroy her when she was no longer useful. The brass hinges of her bedroom door whined. Carissa whipped around. She hadn't heard footsteps. Aquila stood in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, as if he had taken the 3 flights of stairs at a dead sprint. His dark coat was damp with spring rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked wild, frantic, and entirely unhinged. He looked from Carissa's pale face to the open portmanteau on the bed. A muscle feathered violently in his cheek. He stepped into the room and kicked the door shut behind him. The heavy wood slammed with a concussive boom that rattled the cracked pitcher on the washstand. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "My quarter is finished, Your Grace," Carissa said. She forced her chin up, locking her knees to stop them from trembling. "I have received my wages. I am leaving." No, he crossed the small room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed the heavy leather portmanteau, hoisted it off the bed, and threw it roughly onto the floorboards. The silver crowns in her velvet pouch clinked loudly against the wood. "Excuse me." Carissa snapped, her shock instantly dissolving into hot, defensive rage. "You do not dictate my employment. I am a free woman, and I have given my notice." "You haven't given notice, you are running away." Aquila shot back, leaning over her, his sheer physical size dominating the cramped space. "You are terrified because for the first time in your desperately pragmatic life, something actually matters to you." "Do not presume to know me," Carissa yelled, shoving both hands hard against his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall. He didn't budge an inch. "I know how this world works. I am a servant, a paid distraction. When you and your son are finally healed, I will be an awkward reminder of the darkest year of your lives, and you will dismiss me. I am leaving before you can break me." Aquila grabbed her wrists. He didn't squeeze hard enough to bruise, but his grip was absolute steel, pinning her hands between them against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering a violent, frantic rhythm through the damp wool of his coat. "I am already broken." Aquila rasped, his voice tearing on the words, dropping the aristocratic shield entirely. "I have been empty for 3 years. I forgot how to speak to my own son. I forgot how to sit in a room without drowning in scotch to quiet the silence." He stepped closer, backing her up until the edge of the mattress hit the back of her knees. "You didn't fix us with kindness." He continued, his dark eyes blazing, desperate, stripping her bare. "You fixed us with mud and siege engines and absolute unforgiving honesty. I don't want a governess. I don't want a temporary distraction." Carissa stopped fighting his grip. Her breath caught in her throat, a tight, painful knot. "Aquila," he let go of her wrists, sliding his large, rough hands up her arms to cup her face. His calluses scraped against her jawline. His thumbs brushed the frizzy hair away from her temples. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying hunger, not just physical, but a desperate, starving need for an anchor. "I am terrified too," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. The smell of rain and warm skin enveloped her. "I have lost everything I ever thought was permanent. But I cannot let you walk out that door. I am paying you to stay, but I am begging you to want to." Carissa closed her eyes. The cold, cynical armor she had worn for years cracked, splitting wide open and falling to the floorboards alongside her ruined bag. She felt the violent tremble in his hands holding her face. He was not a prince. He was a deeply damaged, messy man, and he was entirely hers. She reached up, tangling her fingers into the damp hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision. It tasted of salt desperation and the sharp bite of unshed tears. It was an argument, a concession, and a vow all at once. Aquila's arms wrapped around her waist, crushing her against him, lifting her slightly off her feet as he backed her fully into the heavy wooden bedpost. Carissa kissed him back with equal starving ferocity, letting go of the 50 pounds, the exit strategy, and the fear. When they finally broke apart, the room was quiet, save for their ragged breathing. Aquila rested his chin on the top of her head, holding her so tightly, her ribs ached. Carissa opened her eyes, looking over his shoulder at the cheap leather bag lying discarded in the dirt on the floor. "I suppose I should unpack," she muttered against his chest. Aquila let out a short, rusty laugh that vibrated against her cheek. "I will buy you a new bag," he said, kissing the crown of her head, "and a new wardrobe, and a properly heated house. Just don't touch the trebuchet," Carissa warned softly, wrapping her arms tighter around his waist. "Ledger and I still need to perfect the counterweight." Aquila pulled back slightly, looking down into her eyes with a faint, genuine smile that reached all the way to the bruised shadows beneath his lashes. "We'll build a bigger one," he promised. "Together." Did Carissa and Aquila's explosive confrontation leave you breathless? Their messy, fiercely pragmatic romance proves that true love isn't always wrapped in poetry. Sometimes it's forged in muddy boots, shared defiance, and absolute honesty. If you love the emotional depth, raw tension, and grounded storytelling of this historical drama, Please hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance readers and subscribe to the channel for more captivating full-length audio stories. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment in Carissa's journey? See you next time.